And we're back, and we're going to take a look at just, how do functions work, or what's some things that are going on behind the scenes here, and what are some faster ways I can do this, because I wrote this out a little bit clunky. So, the first thing I want to show you is this. When we call a function, pretend like we don't even know what the function is. So that doesn't exist anymore. So we're just going on our merry way. We're making a variable that we might have called anything. We're making another variable that we may have called anything. And so when we want to find what those two things add together, we just say, okay, go send it those variables, right? So now imagine that you are the person writing the function and you don't know what the main code is. You don't know that they called those variables x and y. You just know that you want two integers to show up. In fact, they don't even have to be integers, right? You could say two floats can show up, whatever. But because we define them as integers below, we're assuming they're integers here. So the person who creates the function just makes variables up here that don't have to have anything related to the variables down here. They're kind of completely on their own. What happens if this person does create variables that happen to be called x and y, and so they are the same? Is that a problem, or is that okay? It's perfectly okay. What gets confusing is that this x and y are completely different in the computer's memory than these x's and y's. I often call variables boxes that the computer stores things in, right? You have a memory location. It's like a mailbox that puts something in it. So think of this x and y as being completely separate mailboxes than the x and y that you use in the main code. As if, like, I live on a road maybe called Main Street, and, the main code down here, this is called Main Street, and then up here, this is another main street, but they're in two different towns. And so they really have nothing to do with each other. And so that's the way to think about variables and functions, is that they are not related to each other. It's called the scope of the variable. This is the variable scope. And I do talk about this in another video, but it's the most confusing thing about functions, so it's worth talking about. The idea is this variable gets created here, and when it hits return, it gets deleted, and it's its own separate thing. This variable gets created in the main code, and the main code will remember it, but nothing outside of the main code can see it. There's a way to make a variable called a global variable that both of them can see. And we don't need to get into that here, but if up at the top I was to say x equals 4, now suddenly there's a variable that exists before the function gets defined. And in this one I could say global x, that means get ready to use the x that I defined up here. So it's not perfectly set up for that, but that's the general idea of global variables. Good coders try to limit global variables, and they try to make their functions self-contained units that you could use whenever you want, no matter what variable you're using. That can get tricky sometimes. The other thing to talk about is just the return. This is where it sends information back to here. Notice my return is sending total, and it's storing it in a variable called answer. So whenever you return something, it's some information is coming back from this function, and so I can't just say sum xy, because it would get a number and it wouldn't know what to do with that number. You need that number to equal something. It's as if you're saying, what's the answer to this calculation, and then you don't store it anywhere. So you got to say, hey, I want to store the information you're going to send back to me somewhere. Now, because this is a simple example, there's a few things you could do faster. First of all, do you really need to store something in total and then return total? No, you don't. You could actually just say return xy, because it can do the math right here, and then it will say, oh, I evaluate the math thing, and then I can go and hit return. Down here, do I really need to store the answer? No, I really don't. What I could do is I could just say, hey, go ahead and just print directly whatever comes back from this answer, right? So just to make things shorter, you could say print the results of this sum, and you could say here, you could say send the results of my math calculation. Because we're dealing with simple functions, it can be really that easy. And so those are just some shortcuts to think about. There's nothing magical about the variables that are in here that you can just do, print x, y. Just like you could, of course, have just said, give me the answer to x plus y. We're just adding this in to explain how variables work.